Raw clinical observations are messy and prone to bias. To reach a conclusion, these thoughts must be filtered through the structured grid of evidence-based practice. In modern healthcare and academia, systemic analyses cannot rely on anecdotal experience or standard routine. Patient safety and institutional progress demand verifiable proof. Early career researchers often falter by treating the research question as a casual expression of curiosity, rather than a strict mathematical blueprint for the entire study. If the inquiry lacks precision, it compromises the internal validity of every data point collected thereafter. Our objective is to engineer a testable research question from first principles, utilizing professional frameworks that leave no room for ambiguity. If the foundational inquiry is weak, the architecture of methodology and data analysis lacks a stable anchor. Engineering the question establishes the limits and requirements for the entire scientific process. Research architecture begins with a fundamental choice. Are you measuring variables, or are you exploring phenomena? Quantitative research measures the exact relationship between independent variables, the factors you manipulate, and dependent variables, which are the outcomes you measure. These inquiries seek statistical inference. They require specific phrasing, asking to what degree or how much one factor influences another. Qualitative research explores complex human or systemic phenomena using neutral, open-ended language. Qualitative questions must avoid terms that imply cause and effect. Using a word like impact or cause suggests a predetermined outcome, which corrupts the exploratory nature of the study. Instead, qualitative architecture decomposes one central problem into procedural and issue-based sub-questions. The nature of the researcher's curiosity dictates whether the study's architecture will take the shape of a mathematical equation or a thematic map. Quantitative clinical research operates within an uncompromising, rigid architecture. This requires construct alignment. A research question must be inextricably linked to the method used to answer it. When utilizing an established survey or tool, the wording of the research question must explicitly map to the theoretical constructs or the specific underlying concepts of that instrument. This dissertation matrix shows alignment in practice, linking the research questions directly to the Baldrige Quality Survey instrument. In research questions 3 and 4, the variables, customer market focus, and human resources, mirror the instrument's designated categories exactly. The null and alternative hypotheses, marked as HO3 and HA3, follow the exact wording required for the chosen statistical test. A null hypothesis, or HO, is a statement that no relationship exists between the variables being studied. Researchers cannot measure what their chosen instrument is not designed to capture. You cannot assess employee morale if your survey only measures operational output. Methodological misalignment guarantees unusable data. A quantitative question is only as valid as its alignment with the measuring tool. Clinical and epidemiological fields rely on the PICO framework to ensure this level of precision. PICO stands for population, intervention, comparison, outcome, and time. A generic question like, does pharmacist education help diabetics, lacks the parameters necessary for the matrix to process it. We begin with the population. Strictly defining the subject group is the only way to control selection bias, which occurs when participants are not representative of the intended group. We evolve patients with diabetes into adults aged 18 to 64 with uncontrolled type 2 diabetes in primary care. Defining baseline characteristics and settings is essential for establishing clinical relevance. The intervention defines the exact clinical action, exposure, or process being tested. We upgrade the generic term education to 3 visits over 12 months with an ambulatory care pharmacist. Precision in the population and intervention slots transforms a vague idea into a targeted clinical protocol. The comparison slot provides the baseline necessary to measure the intervention's effects. The comparator must be defined just as rigorously as the intervention. We specify 3 visits with a primary care physician rather than a vague reference to usual care. The outcome is the metric that determines the study's success or failure. We define the outcome as a quantifiable data point, the percentage change in A1C, which measures average blood sugar levels over 3 months, and fasting blood glucose. Finally, the time component establishes the strict temporal boundaries of the study. Setting the boundary at 3, 6, and 12 months prevents attrition bias, the loss of participants over time, and dictates when outcomes are recorded. A fully realized PICO question provides the exact operational instructions required to execute a clinical trial. Even a structurally perfect PICO question can fail when confronted with real-world logistical constraints. The finer criteria act as a final reality check. Researchers use this to evaluate if a study is feasible, interesting, novel, ethical, and relevant. Feasibility and ethics require the researcher to have the funding, data access, and safety protocols necessary to complete the study without harming participants. Novelty and relevance ensure the study fills a validated knowledge gap and will impact clinical guidelines, rather than merely replicating existing literature. A question must also be interesting to secure funding and engage the wider scientific community. A research question that cannot pass the finer stress test remains a hypothetical exercise rather than a practical contribution to knowledge. Examining why good ideas fail during peer review reveals the critical importance of scope. These plots represent questions that are either far too broad or obsessively narrow. Broad questions compromise internal validity by making it impossible to isolate confounding variables, external factors that can distort the relationship between your primary variables. Overly narrow questions compromise external validity, making the results impossible to generalize to anyone outside the specific test group. High-quality architecture requires coherence. All elements of the question must logically align. The population must dictate the sampling strategy, and the time frame must respect the biological reality of the intervention. Testing a long-term outcome on a 30-day timeline will yield statistically insignificant, unusable data. Designing a study is an exercise in systemic alignment. A single miscalibrated variable in the question compromises the integrity of the entire dataset. Until data collection officially begins, the research question remains an iterative tool that adapts as the researcher uncovers new constraints. This process requires peer redlining and relentless scoping to tighten the question's parameters. In quantitative research, every word added must specify a variable or define a relationship. Rule 3 requires researchers to explicitly use terms like relate or compare when connecting multiple variables. The complete architecture requires construct alignment, strict PICO parameters, and the finer real-world stress test. Formal research requires an uncompromising system to strip away bias and isolate the truth. Engineering your inquiry through these strict parameters eliminates downstream ambiguity and ensures your study produces rigorous, actionable evidence.